Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. You're doing wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to try to stand on my mark here and make sure that I'm in frame for all the people online. Thank you, everybody, for online for joining as well. And thank you all for making the trip in person. I chose the title Reflections on the Lagoon because there's nothing to me more beautiful than being on the lagoon and seeing the reflections of all the wildlife and nature, and the impact that we've had as individuals on that is something that you just can't help but witness, especially from that nice 10,000-foot view. Big thanks to the pilot friend of mine who took that. So here we now, connecting to nature is the first part of this reflection. So when I was a kid, a little bit of my history, a Florida native, we had a little bit of my history. I'm going to go a little bit more detailed to make you comfortable with who I am so you understand why I'm saying things that I'm saying. It's the thing that I like to do most is talk about this field trip. And I actually had the same conversation with the county commissioners when we were doing our half-cent sales tax initiative here at the MRC and across the county. All those personal stories, I was inspired by people like Vince Lamb and George and other folks that have expressed their personal stories that helped kind of get that half-cent sales tax passed. And I don't know if you were there for some of that, but we're all wearing those big blue shirts and we're out there getting that passed. And it just got passed again, which is really great news. My story was of being a kid here in Brevard County growing up, about 7 years old or so. And we took a field trip to the Maritime Hammock Preserve down where the Berry Island Center is. And we kicked off our shoes, and a man in really short shorts and a big hat and shirt a little bit like this, you know, he took us out in the lagoon. We did the Stingray Shuffle. And I asked him, this is your career, this is your job, you know, this is what you do for a living. You're out here in nature with the wildlife all the time. I said, yeah, of course. Where else would I want to be? And so I asked him, what did I do to do that? How do I become you? What do I do to make the natural world part of my life? Go to school, learn about environmental science. So that's what I did. Went to the University of Florida. Don't hold it against me. And growing up on the lagoon, coming back after UF, I experienced the 2010 super bloom, 2011, and then again in 2016. And a lot of you, of course, are very familiar with that. That's probably one of the reasons why you're here today, is because of all the things that you've seen change on the lagoon in the decades and generations that we've been here. One of my presentations I gave while at the MRC, I used to work here once upon a time, was to a naval academy. And the officers there were a little older than myself by a few decades. And I was asking them what the lagoon was like when they were young, because our generational relationships with our elders is how we know what happened before we got here. And sharing those stories is the connective tissue of our whole culture and our life on the lagoon. And he said it was the color of gin. The water was the color of gin, crystal clear. And I had a hard time even imagining what that must have been like to grow up with the lagoon so healthy, so abundant, just naturally vibrant. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how we got here, because I think it's really important to kind of see the world through the eyes of those that have lived before us to understand where we're going. And for me, it was, I wanted to know more about that. So I started to work at the national parks and other areas, eventually the city of Satellite Beach. After leaving the Marine Resources Council, went to work over there. Now I no longer work for the city, and I'm out working for different environmental agencies or groups, doing a little ecotourism, even started my own business recently to try to consult these concepts to larger organizations to get everybody on the same page using the same language. So that language is something that I'm going to talk a lot about, how we communicate what the health of the lagoon is, the history of it, how it got here, and using the same language and being collectively on the same page as a community so that our message, One Lagoon, hashtag One Lagoon to my friends at the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, that messaging is really important to the people that live here, that visit here, and that grew up here, because even my own friends I've found that I've known for 20 plus years have vastly different views of the health of the lagoon, even though, you know, we sit and have a beer together. That's not the only conversation we have, but it should be one of the ones we have quite often. So that's the love of nature as a Brevard County native kind of coming through and becoming a steward. And I got to this place by not just reading, scientific papers and going to classes and learning about science, but reading things like The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. If you've ever read The Four Agreements, it's a fantastic book, and you might notice some peppered in concepts throughout this presentation. All the works of Terence McKenna, of course, and the community of lagoon scientists and advocates have all kind of inspired my experiences to create this context for you to kind of get a little window into Florida's history, how we got here, what we're doing, and what we can do next. So please take a look at your states, the beautiful state of Florida, wider underwater than you might imagine over the millennia that it took to form it. Depending on how much of a geologist you are and where you are either a lumper or a splitter in the timelines of geology, you could go back 250 million years and you could see the ridge when it split from Africa. This was all Pangea at one time. We know the concept of Pangea from school and what we've learned, but to really see it, the idea that the world is one world, it's a one organism, and it's moving and it's changing and the tectonic plates are always shifting, it's in motion. And when we've split off from Pangea becoming Florida, that limestone outcropping of all the bones, of all the ancestors, of all the fish and the wildlife created the aquifer, which I borrowed from you guys. The MRC has a lovely poster about this from the St. John's. This is the aquifer beneath your feet. There's so much happening beneath your feet. It's how we have fresh water in the state of Florida. All those millions of years of rainwater collecting, moving through the layers, eventually the hawthorn layer above that, the clay layers, solidifying that. That's Florida. Its geologic history is rich. And because of that geologic history, we can click on some links later if you want to talk about that. I have some links to that. The biology was able to form in a mutualistic relationship where the mangroves that we see here at the MRC, that are planted on people's properties, they floated around like they do today, just that same mechanism, that same beautiful mechanism of mangrove propagation, brown side down, of course, floating and finding the sandy shores, growing little islands, and those islands connecting to create the state of Florida. The Okefenokee swamps in Georgia and the Appalachian Mountains, all that sediment, alluvial materials washing down over millennia, forming the land that would actually be held together by the mangrove islands, creating fisheries and rookeries and nurseries. Those seagrasses, those mangroves, those fish, they have a relationship that took millennia to form, millions of years. And if you want to learn more about that, the IRLspecies.org project is really a great place to do that. Again, the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program helped to create that great species inventory there. One of the species that came next after all the biological diversity of wildlife was the native peoples. And I'd like to talk a little bit about them because the respect that they deserve for what they were able to accomplish at a time after the last ice age, 11,800 years ago-ish, depending on, again, your geological slant. We say 12 tribes, there's more than that. There was lots of tribes, but focus in on the one that was here. Let's focus on the Ais, A-I-S, the Ais. They were unique. Many tribes in Florida, they farmed, they had agriculture on some scale. The Ais didn't. They lived off the land in relationship with the land in a way that they knew that they could harvest certain things at certain times of year, leave enough of it to regrow. If you're going to eat oysters, eat enough oysters, but leave enough to regrow. If you're going to eat a little bit of this and a little bit of that, you can actually have a more diverse diet and leave time for populations to regrow so that you never run out of food. It's really a remarkable way of relating to the land that I think we could take a page out of their book today when we're talking about sustainability and all these different concepts. The sustainability of how you live with the land might be the most important part of what sustainability is. And your food source is a big impact that you have on the land. We can all think about that today with agriculture, the impacts of agriculture on food populations and on resources, where it comes down to nutrient inputs to the lagoon. That's part of that as well, right? So all of these things kind of play together in the history of Florida to kind of get us to where we are today. And we've engineered the land through development and we've changed it dramatically. Everybody can think of the canal systems that we've created, the dredging to create, let's say the steamboats and the paddle wheel boats that moved in the 1800s, the railroads that moved. All these things changed the landscape dramatically. And we didn't know at the time, I say we colloquially, I wasn't there, but they didn't know. We didn't know as a species, as a culture. We didn't know the impact that these things would have on the future. We just thought that the environment was so robust, that nature was so strong, that there's nothing that we could possibly do that would damage that system that would seem to be in place, that seemed to just never-ending resources. It's amazing to think that there was a time that that was the idea. You could just harvest coal from mountains forever, and you could power anything you needed to power. You could hunt whales. You see the whale spears here in the Marine Resources Council with the right whale hanging. You can hunt whales for fat and blubber and it wouldn't impact the environment. It's perfectly fine. Fisheries, harvesting millions and millions of fish. Nothing wrong with that. Make money. No end in sight. Completely free reign. And that changes when we start to learn that the economy, the issues of harvesting naturally abundant resources, isn't a system that goes on forever. If it does go up exponentially, eventually, if you've ever skateboarded or surfed or anything like that, you've tried to go up a ramp, what happens when you reach the apex? You fall back down again and you land flat on your back and you look up and you have to marvel at the system that you're in and say, maybe I pushed it too far today. Maybe I need to take a step back and learn a new way of relating to the environment. And that's kind of where we are as a culture. So culture, I'm going to sit down for this one. This is a quote from Terence McKenna. Culture is the condensation of language. All the words that I choose to use in this conversation that we're having, that we have with each other, every word is important. Every word communicates a concept and an idea. And if we're not careful with the words that we choose, we can find ourselves creating a nightmare that we don't want to live in. That's why the idea of speaking with a positive outlook and being optimistic and having ideals and values actually leads you to a better, brighter place. If you focus on all the negatives all the time, or if you use your imagination to create scenarios that you don't want to live in, that doesn't seem to be a good use of your imagination, does it? I use my imagination to imagine a future that I want to live in. I hope that you do the same. And the language that I choose to use communicates that. And so these are the impacts that we find of a normalized language and behavior that we're born into. This system of conversations of the health of the lagoon. I hear so many people talking about, is it healthy enough to help the lagoon? Is the lagoon healthy enough to be helped? And is restoration even a good idea if the lagoon is it healthy enough? Of course it is, right? In your heart, you know that to be true. The best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago, right? The second best time to plant a tree is right now. And to quote Socrates, a society is truly great indeed when old men plant trees whose shade they will never see. The concept is still there. So that behavior should reflect the ideas of the language. And this group-minded mutualistic community concept using the sacred symbiotic connection to nature is the thing that I'm talking about with the reflection that I've gotten to through going through science and going through many jobs. It boils down to that to me, that this symbiotic relationship to nature that maybe the Ais had before us and that all the wildlife seems to have with their relationships that ebb and flow. Well, there's some connection to each other there that maybe we're missing out on by having this individualized, more of a parasitic relationship where we're constantly harvesting resources for our own ends. Now, you have to harvest resources and you have to live, but there might be a better way to do it. So that's our issues. So the timing is that you're born into this situation. You had no real control over that. You were born into a world that was already in motion. We were already experiencing a culture that was thousands of years in process. And you're learning as you go. But the problem is that by the time you actually learn what you need to do, you're almost too old to do it. My back hurts now. I've been lifting mangroves for 20 years and planting along shorelines. I need the help of volunteers in the next generation. And what I've heard from people so often is that, you know, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Have you all heard this before, right? Life isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. Well, what if it's a relay race? What if it's passing the torch to future generations and these concepts and ideas that good happens when we put the work in? So that's the kind of culture and timing that we're born to. Oops. In this natural world. So it's just kind of built on the bones of it. When you build roads and road systems, did they think, you know, when they built 95 on top of the ancient sand dune that it is, because it is an ancient sand dune. 95, Merritt Island, the Barrier Islands are all ancient sand dunes from that picture that I showed earlier of when Florida, you know, changes over time, over millennia of ice ages rising and falling. I think it's like 9 times in the last 200,000 years that the great glaciers have moved and receded, changing landscapes, erasing a lot of things from the landscape and leaving only the natural system to come back. So you can't really take it personally because you're just born into this system. So the best thing that you can do is have a little humility about it and learn as much as you can So how we see the world changes as well. Born into a world of Newtonian physics, the idea that, a place for everything and everything in its place. Well, we learned in the last couple of decades that that's not entirely true either. We learned through quantum mechanics and quantum physics that an electron is both where it is and not where it is. It's there and it's not there. There's so much more to the universe the more that we unfold it. And the lagoon is the same way. The more we learn about how we got here and what's happening, the more we can actually impact our behavior to change the lagoon, because it seems that human beings and our behavior has a direct impact on the environment. We didn't think that 200 years ago as much as we think it now today to be true. It's something that we had to learn over time. So urbanization is kind of in the middle of all that, where we built cities, great cities, subways in New York, aqueducts in Rome, changing the landscape to fit and suit our needs. And here in Florida, we built canal systems because the NASA scientists and engineers needed a place to live, and who doesn't want to live on waterfront property in 1930? And if you're a real estate agent and you own a bunch of property and you want to sell it, what sells better than waterfront property in the 1950s and 60s? So everybody did what they thought was right because that was the cultural aesthetic. It was just normal, and there was no malice intent to get to this position that we're in. So we try to humbly understand that these are our own circumstances that we build. And if we built ourselves into this situation, hopefully we can build ourselves out of this situation as well by changing some of our behavior and our relationship to nature and some of the assumptions that got us here, like the ones that I mentioned earlier, that, maybe the natural world doesn't have an unlimited amount of resources for us in this moment. But if you gave it enough time to rebound and to have a system in place that is naturally renewing, a fountain of youth, if you will, which is what Ponce de Leon was looking for when he came to Florida. Well, the aquifer, I held up that image earlier, is that fountain of youth. But if we drink every last drop and don't let it refill naturally, what happens? We get saltwater intrusion from the sides, from the ocean. The water will find a way in, and then you won't have anything to drink. So it's a little bit of looking forward and learning from our mistakes that can get us into a situation that hopefully, ideally, is optimal, not just for us, but also for the environment. And unfortunately, I have to mention the issues of fishing and farming. We all know, all the way up until the 1980s, we had our clam and oyster farmers making millions of dollars, harvesting millions and millions of oysters and clams. It's the same thing with building the houses. They built all those houses, and about 75%, I think, is the percentage of mangroves that were removed from the environment. So that's a vegetative buffer that provides habitat, filters air and water, reduces erosion. Mangroves absorb 95% of wave energy. So you have this natural system, but when you start to take out pieces, it's almost like a Jenga. Everybody's played Jenga, right? All the blocks are stacked. You pull out a block, your friend pulls out a block. Well, I was in the Master Naturalist class, and this woman, she created a Jenga. If someone's going to create this online, give her 10% of your profits. But invasive species and native species were part of this Jenga. And when you took out the native species or a watershed, you had to replace it with something or leave it empty. And then what happens? The Jenga falls over because you don't have a healthy, robust, resilient system anymore. You have a system that's built to move stormwater off of the mainland, all your roofs, your roadways, your sidewalks, all your impervious pavement, move stormwater at a faster rate than nature could ever accommodate in such a short period of time. It takes biology a long time to respond to changes, which is why nature changes slowly over time. It can resiliently withstand a hurricane or an impact of a sea level rise or fall and come back at a large scale, but on a short scale, if you're pumping fresh water into a lagoon that's not designed to have roadways and rooftops, it's designed to have saltwater marshes and mangrove fringe forests, well, that's going to dramatically change the ecology of the lagoon. And that's what we saw in 2010 with the algae bloom, all the nutrients building up to the point that we have the algae bloom, the seagrass dies off, changes the ecology. And now maybe our ecology is changed in a way that it's not dominated by seagrass, that it's dominated by an algae-based phytoplankton system. But hopefully it hasn't transitioned that far yet, because I don't know about you, but I'd rather live in a seagrass-dominated environment full of mangroves, seagrasses, and wildlife. So this is the kind of idea of getting rid of these old ideas of how we relate to the land and maybe changing them, because the aesthetics is what we view as normal, whether it's a St. Augustine lawn. It doesn't have to be that way. I know my grandfather, every weekend I'd be over there at his house, making that St. Augustine lawn look perfect for that HOA. It can only be so tall and there can't be any brown spots, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? We know now that leftover, maybe it was left over from the 1500s from some of those really rich French landowners or somebody to poke fun at somebody that doesn't exist and is dead for 100 years or more. Maybe it was passed on from them, the idea that I'm so rich that I can own land, cut it down and only have grass. And that shows how wealthy I am, that I can maintain this completely unnatural, unnecessary landscape. Well, we know now, 2023, that just because in 1995 it was thought of as a good idea, doesn't mean it's a good idea today. Just because I grew up with it as a good idea, as an aesthetic norm, doesn't mean that it has to be in the future, which is why we see people like the Conradina Native Plant Society, who use native plants to help vegetate buffers of people's homes. Planting native plants reduces the amount of nutrients needed. Building bioswales or rain gardens reduces those impacts to the lagoon. There's so much that we can do that we don't need to have the old ideas dominate a good idea that's new. We can say goodbye and wish it well and thank it for what it did to get us here, but we don't need it anymore. So I hope that when you go home and you look at all the roadways and rooftops and you see what the aesthetics were when you entered this room, and maybe for a lot of you, that's not true. Maybe for a lot of you today, you're like, oh, that's obvious. It's obvious that I don't need a green St. Augustine lawn just because my HOA says I have to. It's obvious that I should plant native plants that are native to the place that I live. Well, thank you for being part of the solution. Appreciate that. So that's what's next. We get involved. We spend our time with each other in a cultural collective that is communicating with a similar language to get us to a place that we are living in paradise, because we do live in paradise. People come from all over the world to visit us here in Brevard County. I've traveled a few places. I always come home. There is no place like Brevard County, especially right here on the lagoon. And if you want to get more involved with some of these organizations that do this work, start with the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, IRLNEP, #OneLagoon. Visit their website. If you're wondering what's going on in your area, there's so much happening. There is more happening than I could possibly talk about in 45 minutes, which is why I decided to kind of shift the talk to more of a cultural communication of language, because all of this stuff has been said. The 150 plus projects that the county is doing as part of the SORL program, all the grants the IRLNEP does. Thank you again to the IRLNEP for all the grants to help to fund the projects that I got to be a part of. When I worked at the city of Satellite Beach, the first grant that I wrote was to the IRLNEP for stormwater reduction. And then the second one to the Samson's Island Submerged Lands Restoration Project, funded by the IRLNEP in phase 1, and then the TDC in phases 2 and 3 to restore oysters, clams, and seagrasses. That was all paid through partnerships and grant funding, and the support, of course, of the city as well, because you have to have that support. But we'll talk a little bit about that now. Caitlin, you want to click on that? Because I know a lot of you probably were thinking, based off of my history, that this is something that I was going to dive deep into. I don't want to leave you without at least a little overview of what that's like. So please visit the city website, check out the story map. If you want to join and volunteer, that little link right there will take you to the story map. A big shout out to the Eastern Central Florida Regional Planning Council for the help of creating this. And of course, to the whole city for supporting this. Great city, wonderful work being done. All these partners here, all the funding and the phases get described. And I got to work with some fantastic people from the University of Florida, from Florida Oceanographic Society, Marine Discovery Center. Like I said, Marine Discovery Center helped with the oysters, FOS, Florida Oceanographic helped with the clams, with the oysters and the seagrasses, UF helped with the clams. Oh, this one's really fun, actually. Go ahead and slide that one. So just an idea of like how urbanization affects the landscape. Look at these sandy beaches over here on Merritt Island and the ephemeral wetlands and swamps. It all really changes after urbanization changes flow and everything is held in place. So we, when I was at the city, we did a lot of great work here, and FIT did the water quality work. Dr. Fox has continuing work across the lagoon on that. and KBB helped with some volunteer outreach, and then go down, down, down. It's a lengthy one. But the way that the story map works is you can kind of hear the story of the different materials we used for the oyster restoration. The idea was that the seagrass restoration with FOS. The idea behind the oyster work that's being done is they're testing the materials. And it's really great that they're testing the materials. Science takes time. There's fits and starts. And this is a well-known clam photo that we took when we dispersed the clams with UF. And then, of course, getting volunteers involved and educating the public is an important part of any environmental action. Get your friends to join you. Mapping and monitoring. Originally, there was larger 75-foot breakwaters, and the clams were under nets, but in phase 2 and 3, we changed that and actually increased the gaps to allow for more flow on site, because we learned a lot in the process of doing the project on how it's done, because lagoon restoration is a newer science. So like all new science, you have to kind of give it, go to the next one for phase 3. You have to give it time. Scientists have to learn as they do, I don't know about you, but as a kid, I always learned by doing. And so here is the current project, again, on the City of Satellite Beach website, where these points are clickable. And if you click on any of these seagrass points, you'll see when it was last surveyed, the data point. It's going to take a minute because there's a lot of data on there. You can click on the clams, you can click on the breakwaters. But basically, at the end of phase 2, there was about 55% survivorship of seagrass at this particular project site. And the clams were doing okay, about 30% overall in the last year. But in that last month, actually, 92% success of the clams. That's because the salinity didn't fluctuate because of the stormwater, because we weren't having a lot of rain. No freshwater pulses, no biological response of death, because that's the #1 biological response to being flooded as a clam of fresh water, is you're just going to die. But these super clams that that Todd Osborne got, they're super clams for a reason. They did survive. So did they click at all? Yeah, they're clickable. There you go. So that particular location, 52% occurrence, right? And no photo for that one, but some of them have photos. Some of them actually, since this was done, a whole nother transect was planted for volunteers to survey to get that community. Go to like the top one. Yeah, like one of those. Here? Down, yeah, that one. There we go. So 919, 32%. There's a photo, grab a photo. So of the actual seagrass in that actual location, this is the Haladuli variety of seagrass. And again, it was a thrill, a lifelong goal to be a part of that. I can't thank the city enough, and all the funding agencies and the partners and the volunteers. Thousands of volunteers came out to do this project over the course of the 3 years. And so projects like this, Cocoa Beach is doing one as well. You want to jump back to the other one? Cocoa Beach recently did one where they had a seawall at their park, where they have mangroves planted in these baskets where the oyster shells are underneath. I don't know where they got the idea, but once upon a time, a certain gentleman may have come up with an idea for a hangrove about 2 decades ago. But it's good to see these ideas be implemented. And now we're seeing them implemented in multiple cities across the county. Thank you as residents to funding these types of things. Please be involved in your community as much as possible. Join a board, join a club. Find a group, or even in your own home, talk about these ideas with your family and make sure the next generation is having these conversations. Because if we don't have these conversations, we're not going to move forward. These are the difficult things to talk about, is the more spiritual relationship that we have with nature. We come from nature. If we want to go to the next slide, we can do some lessons learned. And we could say that, this communication, being impeccable with our words, is another one of those 4 agreements that I talked about. But the life is an ocean of communication and coordination and cooperation. And it's ongoing all the time, every moment, every day, every conversation that you have can have that joy, that celebration of the connection to nature. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Gaia hypothesis, but it says, that the earth is a self-regulating system. And it is communicating its intent to us all the time if we could only listen. And as an intelligent species, we deny this at our own peril. When your tree in your yard is sick. It's pretty obvious when your rose bush needs water. It's wilting. You give it some water. You can listen to nature. It has communication with you. And if you're quiet, you can hear it. And if we change our perspective to realize that we need to make a commitment to nature, and that nature is not passive, it is active, and that we do not live on the planet. This is a direct Terence McKenna quote. We do not live on the planet, we live in the planet. So we do not live on the planet, we live in the planet. We are part of this system. And if we act and exhibit those behaviors that reflect that, it's almost an obligation to celebrate this fact. So I hope that you can kind of see this relationship as something that is important in every aspect of your life, and the things that we buy as consumers reflect that. We know the issues with plastic in the environment. It's a fact. We know that the plastic doesn't biodegrade, it photodegrades, meaning it just gets smaller and smaller. Eventually a fish might eat it, and then you might eat that fish, but that plastic has absorbed all kinds of different chemicals, whether it's toxins or pharmaceuticals. We want to reduce that pathway and going in that direction. So don't buy plastic. It's a really easy answer. It's hard to do, admittedly. It's hard to do to change behavior. I still at times, when I go to a restaurant, I forget to tell them, don't give me a straw. And then there's a straw in my drink. I remind them, oh, I got a to-go cup. Can I get an iced tea to go? And I hand them my to-go, and they still put a straw on it, or sometimes they give me another cup next to my to-go cup, and they're like, okay, you can pour it in there. Like, impeccable with their words, communicating very clearly and calmly with each other in every aspect is so important. So that's the relationship, that healthy relationship of stewardship in everything that we do. All these actions that we have are stewardship actions. There's a quote from Lord of the Rings that I have later on if we want to get into it, but it's the idea that we are all stewards of the land. And that if you're familiar with Arthurian legend, with the Grail, of the Holy Grail, the Grail was the land, and the king is the land, and the land is the king. We are all just stewards of this land. And we need to honor the land as if it was royalty, because it does provide for us everything that gives us life. There's nothing created nor destroyed. E equals MC squared. It's just energy, and it's just us in here together. And if we can communicate that, remember that, we'll find empathy and compassion, and those guiding lights can lead us towards great things. And I hope that this talk has inspired you to have these difficult conversations and maybe find the language and some of the words to communicate these difficult concepts that we sometimes forget when we get caught up in the new science of what we're doing, that the connection to the environment is always number one. And that's why with restoration, they're trying new methods and new materials, that they're growing different seagrasses, and that they're working with the super clams, and that the cleanups happen. I mean, even these cleanups, you might feel sometimes that, oh, what does picking up a few pounds or 100 pounds of trash really do when, corporations are producing plastic at a rate that is just unfathomable. And yes, you could be frustrated that the Indian in the Coca-Cola commercial in 1970, whatever it was, he was actually an Italian actor, and that's the company telling you that you're responsible for us because we made plastic possible. Although we knew we could give you a Coke bottle in glass, we switched from glass to plastic, and now it's your responsibility to clean it up. That is just backwards, in my opinion. And I know that we can do better. I know that we can do better because we did it 7,000 years ago when we were native people, when we were the Ais. We made things out of clay. We made things out of bone. We lived in harmony with nature. We found the rhythms and the cycles of nature, and we listened to them, and we moved. We knew a hurricane was coming in the winter, so we moved off the beach. We knew that the seasons would change, and that's when we plant certain crops. We still know this today. And I love the 50s because you had victory gardens. I don't know if anybody here had a victory garden, but I have one in my backyard. It needs a lot of work, but it's those little things of growing your own food, having chickens. You can have chickens in your backyard. In Melbourne and Satellite Beach, you can have your own eggs. You know how much the price of eggs has gone up since I was a kid? It's unbelievable. The price of cereal through the roof. What can we do to reduce our dependency on a system that isn't sustainable? We can look back to nature. And I hope that the next time that you find yourself upset with the system that you were born into, that the solution of looking back to nature for guidance is the first thing that you think of. And maybe take a deep breath, drink a cold glass of water, Celebrate all the bounty that's around you and re-nourish it by composting in your backyard, right? You can compost the banana peels and the eggshells. You can do all these little things and they all add up. And if we all do little things, it really adds up. And everybody on the lagoon, whether they're west next to 95 or live right on the beaches, we're all in the same watershed. It's all our backyard. We're all connected. We may drive cars and our culture might isolate us into having our individual little tiny spheres, but we're all in this together. It's just us in here. And nature doesn't really care, honestly. It'll, as George Carlin said, the earth will shake off the human race like a bad case of fleas. We have to work together for our own survival. And seeing the lagoon go through what it's gone through in my lifetime has reminded me of that fact. So I try to connect with everybody I can through conversations like this. I like this more than the internet, personally. I'm not online as much, but thank you for all of you online. Facebook posting every day, it can be exhausting. Instagram posting, all the social media stuff, but it is valuable. And it is very important that we learn to use these tools that we've developed out of the technology that grew from some of these behaviors that maybe we could do better. We can learn how to hopefully find alternatives to these plastics. I know in Europe, they're using potato starch, right? They're 3D printing things out of biodegradable materials and learning how to make them last long enough. Hemp, good old fashioned hemp that the Pinta and the Santa Maria sailed here on. Perfectly good, viable materials that you can learn how to harvest, synthesize, and use instead of plastic. But we as consumers dictate that relationship. So finding that empowerment in the choices that you make should hopefully give you the courage to make the hard decisions in those moments that unfortunately arise daily more often than I would like them to. And I want to leave you with this thought again, that it's your relationship to nature that's going to make you a steward. And being a steward of the land, I don't think there's any higher calling. So again, my name is Nick Sanzone. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this talk. And then hopefully now we can have a little conversation with questions about anything that relates to any of these topics here. And if you want to dive more deeper into the science, we can do that. But the science will take us so far, but it's the cultural conversations that's going to take us further. So I want to thank you again. Thank you so much. And thank you to the MRC for hosting.
Thank you so much, Nick. We are going to go ahead and start our question and answer period now. So for those in the live audience, if you have your note card still and you have a question on it, I'm going to be coming around in a moment and grabbing those. So we're going to start with some Zoom questions. What are you most excited for the future of the lagoon, Nick?
Oh, wow. Well, so many things. Wow. Well, of course, the return of all the wildlife and the health of the ecosystem and the seagrass restoration. I really fell in love with seagrass restoration in the last couple of years. I just love being in the water and seeing volunteers' face when they first submerge for the first time. You know, when you're driving over the bridge, you see the surface of the water and you only see so much. When you're in the lagoon and you actually snorkel, it's only 2 feet deep. You can stand up. You're not going to drown. It's fine. But to see those faces of those volunteers and see those stories come out, I think that's the thing I'm most excited for, is to see future generations continue to pass the torch. Because I know that for me, my #1 volunteer is Jackson, who's been on my volunteer list for years now. And he was part of the Samson's Island project for over 3 years. And I know that that young man is going to continue the work in one way, shape, form, or another and pass that torch. So definitely excited to see the passing of the torch. However, more on a more structural kind of version of that answer is maybe one day the bridges won't be causeways. I think it'd be really great to see the bridges replaced with a larger bridge that isn't such a land-based bridge that blocks flow. I know that it would change things a lot and that our ecosystem has changed a lot. Seawalls being replaced with shorelines with buffers and more native plants being planted, those types of things. You know, it'd be nice to go and see no lawns, right? Wouldn't that be a nice future of no lawns and just natives? That would be wonderful for me of one of those things. But I think for me, it's always going to be the volunteers and the people and seeing that personal connection happen. When you see a personal connection happen to somebody that's not used to being in nature, right here at the MRC, actually, when I first did restoration work and planting potting mangroves, kids were afraid to touch the dirt. This is something that blew my mind. The kids were afraid to touch the dirt because it was foreign to them. They'd never touched dirt before. It's dirt. But I explained to them as a soil scientist that there is no such thing as dirt. And there's only sand, silt, and clay and organic matter. Dirt is a term that we use because we don't understand what a thing is. And when we don't understand what a thing is, we can be afraid of it. But once you understand what a thing is, then you could find where it fits in your mind, and then you can be comfortable with it. And then the kids, oh, look, there's a worm. Okay, I know what that is. They touched it. They planted a mangrove. Everything changed for these kids. And I love seeing that. So a little bit about that. I hope that answers your question.
Amazing. In your opinion, what is the biggest target for nutrient reduction in the northern Indian River Lagoon?
Oof, tough question. They always say that the lagoon got to where it is by a depth of 1,000 cuts. So it's kind of hard to point the finger at any one thing. But, you know, an easy target for me, of course, is the lawns. When you buy sod, you know how much soil comes off of that sod on the first flush of rain? Pounds. It's unbelievable. I think it was like 30% or something. It's an unbelievable number. Look up the science, Google it. But I think that's just something that blows me away of like contributions to the lagoon. And you see people that they come in and they buy a house and they resod it. Like I just saw this the other day. And like, I wanted to run up to them and be like, wait, there's a better option. You know, they just resodded it and the grass is there, all the nutrients that require that. You know, I think it's the landscape and the sod, I think is, you know, one of the biggest, like, culture, sure. But ultimately also on that same train of thought, you can't have that contribution without the stormwater. So the stormwater component to that is really important because of the amount of flushing that happens. So if we had more natural areas, pervious sidewalks and pavements, you know, that would be a big change too. We have so much pavement in the county. Imagine all that pavement was permeable and that the rainwater could soak through it. Well, that'd be a huge change too. So all those nutrients get there through the stormwater. So maybe a little combination of those. But again, there's so many. There's so many.
So what volunteer opportunities exist in Satellite Beach? And then this person also wants to make everyone aware that there's a UP extension starting June 19th that's offering a 4-week grow your own food class.
Hey,
we sort of touched on. So,
very cool.
Yes. So what opportunities exist in Satellite Beach?
Oh, so many. It's such a great city. Go to the rec department page, you know, always visit the rec department, talk to them. There's volunteer opportunities to do everything from beach cleanups to lagoon work. There's volunteer opportunities to serve on boards, of course. Serve on a board, that's a volunteer opportunity. Tip your hat to any volunteers out there serving on boards because they're not getting paid. Let's see, other volunteer opportunities. There's events you can volunteer. If you get on a board, you can volunteer to help out at events. There's so many. Of course, the lagoon restoration. We talked about this, the Samson's Island project. I believe that's still continuing as well. You can also volunteer to help on Samson's Island proper and do invasive species removal. It's another thing that they're doing over there. But contact the city, talk to the rec department, talk to this planning and sustainability department, give them an email, give them a shout. They're always happy to chat with you about the different things going on. Big volunteer-based community in the city.
And we had a related question that came from the audience as well, too, about volunteer opportunities for high school students in Brevard County. Do you know any specific opportunities for youth? For high school students, definitely you want to get involved with the Day in the Life of the Lagoon. Missy Weiss does a Day in the Life. It's lagoon-wide. It involves everyone and anyone. Please get involved. Basically, the idea of this event is a snapshot. So you want to know what's happening in the lagoon, you kind of got to know what's happening at the lagoon in snapshots in time because it's always changing. And what's happening in Mosquito Lagoon might be different than what's happening in the Banana River or the Indian River. So this great concept, is to get volunteers to sample water quality and sediments and look at the vegetation and other things happening at specific spots. So maybe like Rotary Park is one location. When I was at the city, we talked about Samson's Island being a possible location. I don't know if that's going to happen. MRC, I believe, is a location as well. So there's hundreds of locations across the lagoon. Environmental Learning Center, ELC, I think, is another location down south.
that you can get involved with this day in the life of the lagoon. Great volunteer opportunity for students. That's probably the most concise, direct answer I'm going to give all day.
Here's an interesting one. This person writes in and says, I have never seen the Indian River as clear as it currently is. We have at least 4 species of macroalgae and 1 or 2 actual seagrasses right off our property in Merritt Island. Why do you think the river water is so clear this year? Could it be the effects of last year's storms on the area?
Ooh, good question. Good question. Well, okay, we actually, I had this conversation earlier today with someone who visited the Lagoon House, and Jim was nice enough to talk to him about this, and the gentleman asked the same question. And it's a combination, again, of a lot of things. You have these larger cycles of hurricanes and stormwater pulses that happen, and we haven't had a lot of that recently, right? So the lack of rain is an issue that is benefiting the lagoon because you're not getting a lot of churning, right? The muck, the legacy loads, all those nutrients in there, you're not getting a lot of churning from the high winds and the rains that flush all that into the system. So when the hurricanes come around again, we might have another issue. But in between those seasons, I think about it, it's kind of like visiting your doctor, and you're like, I exercised, I did a lot of good work. How's my blood work this month? Oh, it's better than it was before. Well, if you go back to a bad diet and no exercise, it's going to change again. Our lagoon has been eating nothing but McDonald's hamburgers for the last 200 years, and it's had a few heart attacks. You got to change that behavior for a longer period of time. So in a small window, yes, we're doing better. It's great to see the macroalgae and the seagrass. The restoration work is doing really well. And you got to take advantage of those opportunities 100%. And this is the time that the zoo is doing a lot of great work. Brevard Zoo, big shout out to Brevard Zoo and all the great work they're doing. Of course, FOS, MDC, UF, all the partners I mentioned, Florida Atlantic University as well. They're seizing the moment when the lagoon is healthy to make it healthier in the long term. But we're not going to plant our way out of this, right? That's what's been said and agreed, that it's going to take a long-term view. And we're going to have some moments where it doesn't look so good and some moments where it looks really good. If you remember during the pandemic too, when no one was driving, I don't know if anybody did get out a little bit, the lagoon was really clean. There was a lot less traffic, a lot less boat traffic. And we have to contribute these small wins to these small changes. But if we want a big win, we need a big change over time. So that's hopefully a push in the right direction to see that it is happening and it is working. And all that restoration, I mean, an adult oyster filters between 30 and 50 gallons of water a day, right? So if an adult oyster is filtering water, and we've been planting all these thousands of oysters, I know on that project site, we grew over 2,000 of them. Well, we grew over 3,000, but about 1,000 probably got eaten because that's the circle of life. The rest of them doing their job, that's helping as well. Also, the vegetated buffers going in, this particular person with your seagrass, I imagine that individual probably has some landscaping on their personal property that has helped that. And I'd love to talk to them about that and be curious about that. But yeah, absolutely. It's being better. The reasons why are these short-term windows of lack of high rain. But once we get into that rainy season, that's going to change. All that runoff is going to change. But also on a long term, the little increment is definitely because the behavior has changed too, right? Since 2010, the behavior has definitely changed. And that does also impact the lagoon to create a healthier environment that we start seeing the impacts of. So a little bit of that.
Why has Brevard County not implemented a no plastic bag policy where you bring a reusable bag or get charged 5 cents per plastic bag used?
Ooh, wow, what a great political question. Since I don't work for any agency right now, I can say whatever I want, which is really nice. Why haven't they done it? Well, Publix is a really big employer and there's a lot of money involved in that. And they've changed in other areas, but it's really a cultural thing more than it's an economic business thing. I think that if we just stop taking plastic bags from Publix, they're going to stop giving them out. It's a supply demand curve. I don't see it anything different than that. As much as it's influenced in certain directions that they might always have plastic as an option, but you don't ever have to take it. And eventually they're just going to stop shipping plastic bags to that store. And that store is eventually going to stop asking for it from corporate. And then if every Publix across the state, and every shopping institution does that, it'll change. I mean, we have a fertilizer ban in June, but Lowe's still sells fertilizer. I mean, luckily the MRC is trying to educate and and do things along those lines. But it's the behavioral change of the supply demand curve that we have control over that's going to change things. So I kind of jumped around that question a little bit, but read it to me one more time. I want to make sure I give them a good answer.
Yeah, it was just why is Brevard County not implemented a no plastic bag?
Oh, well, I mean, politically bans are always political suicide, right? So you want to get reelected, you want to walk a middle ground and not offend people, and you don't want to make this group mad at you, and you don't want to piss off that group. You want to keep things as simple as possible politically, unfortunately, and nothing really big happens politically, and it's going to be on us as residents to make the big change. Don't wait for your political people to make changes. Be the change that you want to see in the world, right? So the reason that it hasn't happened, because I guess it's not politically advantageous to push it, you know?
Right. Why aren't local organizations reaching out more to HOAs to educate and encourage them to change covenant documents to reduce use of improper landscaping? And I know I can speak to that and say it is very hard to reach HOAs.
Very hard to reach HOAs. Few reasons here. One, they are reaching out to HOAs. Some of them, most of them, a lot of organizations. You need to get on your HOA board, number one. That's the only way that you're going to change that HOA. HOAs have become corporatized, right? We know that when I lived in a housing development right off of Wickham, they had all of these ridiculous landscape codes. And I had 4 oak trees on my property, and all the leaves would fall and no grass would grow. And I tried to explain to them, there's no need to plant St. Augustine grass under this oak tree. It's just going to die in the next couple of years because that's not the ecology that we live in. And the HOA was like, no, we're a corporation. We're based in Orlando. Pay your fees or move. That's it. The personal touch, is so important that you can. It's very difficult with an HOA unless you can get on the board. Communicating with them, you can write letters, but that's like writing a letter to Toshiba about your VHS player that is out of stock. I don't know that they're going to respond anymore. It's really hard with HOAs. Sometimes the best thing to do with an HOA is to kind of show them through example, right? If you're like, look, native plants are beautiful. Here's an example of beautiful native plants planted well. I created large islands on my property to reduce the amount of grass that I have. Here's an example of how that works. Lead by example. So they are reaching out. It's hard to reach out to them because they don't want to listen mostly, right? They just want your money. They just want your HOA fees. They're not here to help the environment. They're here to make a profit. And they're part of an economic system that is not sustainable. And hopefully one day we won't have HOAs. I hope to live in a world without HOAs one day. And you know what? Offense to all the HOAs out there. Go away. We don't need you. We can plant around a pond. We know that a pond vegetative buffer is going to help reduce stormwater. Why, when an HOA comes in and builds a pond, do they not naturally vegetate it? Explain that to me. HOA, you want people to live in your area, have some wildlife in your area. You want wildlife, you got to have wildlife. You need plants to have animals. You want people to be happy and live in a place that isn't a cardboard, sterile environment. You're going to need to accept some nature into your world that isn't just cookie cutter from the box stores, because box stores sell things to make profits. Go to your local nurseries and talk to your native plant societies to find out what works. And you'll find that there are plenty of alternatives to all this. And don't wait for the HOAs, I say. I love not having an affiliation that I can just say these things. It's really freeing.
Well, on the lines of no affiliation, do you have an opinion on the constitutional ballot petition for the right to clean and healthy waters?
We should all have the right to clean and healthy water.
Excellent answer.
What does that mean? How does language get twisted in politics and with laws? It's very dangerous. Make sure you read these things if you're going to vote on these things. Well, again, language. Having language and words mean something. Words have meaning. They have gravity. They have weight. A concept has weight. And if you start to just say things without, it's so weird when you read laws and the way that things are written that they take and they twist words to mean what they want it to mean, right? Because you could say that, and depending on who wrote that and how it was written, it can mean one thing that I think it means, but it can mean something completely different. Does the right to clean water mean that I own the land and all the water that flows under my property I can harvest out and sell and make millions of dollars? Is that what the right to clean water means to you? Is that what that means? Or does the right to clean water mean that I have the right to treat water as sacred and it's not owned by an individual, and that it should be protected at all costs, and we should not pollute. Is that what that means? You have to make sure that these things are defined in such a way that you're getting the thing that you want out of it. So if you're going to vote on stuff, read it. Make sure you read it. I haven't read that entire article. I've read it. I've talked to the advocate group, so I know that it does mean what I want it to mean, of course. But in a generally larger context, those laws they pass at 6:30 in the morning or 2:30 a.m. Oh boy, they just write what they want inside of a one paragraph inside of 30 pages. Who's reading these things? That's not a way to do politics and to govern. That's not governing. That's strange behavior. So yes, but also be careful.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question here. So we'll end with this one. Does restoration inspire or does it require immersion and commitment?
Both. It requires immersion and commitment and inspires, absolutely both. I got into this because of the work that was being done, right? So I visited that 7th grade field trip that I mentioned, and we went into the lagoon. That was restoration work that was being done that inspired me to then continue the process to pass the torch. So yeah, absolutely. Be inspired all the time. As I've heard said, Sadhguru is a guru out of India, and he says, be joyful, always, all the time. Exuberant joyfulness is how we should live every moment of our day. Happiness may be fleeting based off of external factors, but the joy that you feel with the connection to nature and your place in this beautiful world should always be a source of joy. And that is inspiring and hopefully leads to stewardship, which is restoration in action. So thank you to all the people that asked questions online and in person. If you want to chat after, I'm happy to chat. I'll be just walking around a little bit. So thank you again to the MRC, and thank you all for coming out.
Wonderful.
Appreciate you.
Thanks so much.
And here's your remote back.
Thank you.
Good job.